Welcome to USMNT Weekly on the Total Soccer Show, where we bring all our focus to the national team. Today, we're mixing up the format and answering your questions about the USMNT, including the baffling lack of Europa League representation from the national team, or is there? Poch's fullback options, creating an environment for Johnny Cardoso to thrive, and much, much more. My name's Ryan Bailey. Joining me today, the Taylor Rockwell. Hello, Taylor.
Hello. I like that we're going to create some sort of paddock for Johnny Cardoso. As we all know, Johnny Cardoso doesn't want to be fed. He wants to hunt, so we want to make sure he gets enough room and space to kind of roam around and do the things he wants. I'm glad we're finally creating the Johnny Cardoso habitat.
Yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice all of us are actually in white lab coats. So we've got little clipboards, and we're trying to nurture as much as possible during this hour.
And we are trying our best to contemplate whether or not we should, while also contemplating if we could. We're trying to learn lessons from past generations, is what I'm saying. Joe, are these references doing anything for you?
They're hitting just one after another. It's like, man, that one's good. Oh, that one's good. I relate to that. Yeah, no, I'm in. I'm all in.
Joe Lowry's here. Taylor's referring to the guy from Wicked, who used to be a handsome doctor who took his glasses off in astonishment occasionally.
I'm not sure what to believe or who to believe anymore. All I know is that this lab coat is fitting me quite well. I'm enjoying this.
Wonderful.
Ryan, did you happen to see the pictures of Jeff Goldblum at the Oscars, casually scrolling through pictures of himself at the Oscars? That was a terrific moment that felt dead on brand for Jeff Goldblum.
We have a lot to get to on this episode from listener questions, but can we just take a moment to acknowledge that Jeff Goldblum is a delight?
Yes,
he's
we can and
he?
should. And it should be a national day. March 5th from now on is Joe doing Jeff Goldblum impressions. I need more of that in my life.
No, that was tenuous at best, and that will be all from me.
Yeah, lots of classic roles. None greater than Ruxin's father in the league, of course. We're all agreed.
Just them sort of gently growling at each other is terrific.
Terrific indeed. As will this episode of the Total Soccer Show be. That's great grammar. Patreon.com/Total Soccer Show, by the way, is where you'll get our bonus content, bonus episodes, bonus video content, and access to our Discord server where it's popping off 24/7 with all the cool kids. Right, Joe? Is that right?
All the cool kids except you, listener or viewer, unless you're already in which case, all the cool kids, and forget what I said before. Yeah.
You welcome to the fold. No cool kids. Patreon.com/Total Soccer Show. If you'd like to support us, please and thank you. We do love our Discord community. Thank you very much indeed. All right, let's get to the listener questions USMNT style, shall we? Richard Rolson, Alliteration's very own, has been in touch and asks, whatever happened to Erik Palmer-Brown? All right, Taylor, he was on the books at Man City. Seems to, from what I can see, have been under the radar in more countries than Carmen Sandiego, this guy. So where on earth is Erik Palmer-Brown is my question for you, Taylor.
You stole the Carmen Sandiego reference from me, because this does feel like an episode of a TV show we should star. Where is Erik Palmer-Brown? It's a fair question. Yes, because Erik Palmer-Brown breaks through when he makes his move to Manchester City in January of 2018. I would also say that is the start of the kind of downslide for him, because he is never going to be a Manchester City player, evidenced by the fact that he gets loaned out repeatedly. He's loaned to KV Kortrijk in Belgium for the rest of that season. Then it's NAC Breda. Then it's 2 years in Austria. Then it's another loan to Troyes in Ligue 1, and then he eventually makes that move permanent. And I think there are a few things that explain kind of what has happened in his career. I would say one is essentially that he found his level. I think the most success he has had, the most sustained success in terms of starts and appearances, would be playing in Austria with Austria Vienna, and then playing for Troyes in the French league. And that feels about where he has been comfortable. However, there is a pretty sizable injury issue here as well. He moves from Troyes to Panathinaikos in 2013, I believe. And from what I read... What's that, Joe?
2023, not 2013. Keep going. You're in the flow. I was preempting an email. That's all. And angry.
I appreciate that. I am slightly confused about what has happened to him, but essentially he gets a sprain in September of 2023 that keeps him out for 2 to 3 weeks. And at the end of those 3 weeks, it seems like he is diagnosed with bone marrow swelling, which is apparently a very rare bone marrow disease that causes debilitating pain. And he essentially is recuperating for the rest of that season. He comes back and then is, I think, pretty much injured right away. This season, he hasn't really played up until January of 2025. He starts playing again regularly for Panathinaikos. But then, after starting 4 games in a row, gets another injury and is now out again is supposedly like day to day, week to week, what have you. But I think if you're looking at it, it's basically the City move was at that time when players were making those moves, similar to some of the Chelsea players where they go, but then they're going to be loaned out and they're going to be kind of moved around until eventually somebody spends a little bit of money on them. But they're never really going to be a City player. He finds his level kind of where he did, and I would say the Greek Super League is a fine and competitive league. It's just maybe not what the hype was expecting early on. But then there are injuries, and one other personal note, I apologize for going so long and covering so many bases, but he has a teammate at Panathinaikos that he is very, very close with named George Baldock, and he is the one who passed away under mysterious circumstances in his own pool. By all accounts, it hit Erik Palmer-Brown very, very hard. They were next to each other in the locker room. They were very close friends, and so there was also kind of reporting that EPB was having trouble sleeping at night, was having trouble getting over it. So I think it's just been a rough time in his personal life, a rough time with injuries, but then kind of finding his level along the way.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary, Taylor, of what has happened with Erik Palmer-Brown. I love that we're starting this episode off with a guys remembering dudes question.
Yep,
that feels very
it's
fitting.
The rule.
A couple of things here. The first is, I guess, to try to add a bit more levity back into some of this, because that is important ground that you have covered, Taylor. When I was researching Erik Palmer-Brown, I just copied straight from the question that Richard asked, and I accidentally left a question mark in the bit. So instead of Googling Erik Palmer-Brown, I Googled Erik Palmer-Brown, which kind of feels fitting for the career that he has ended up having. That's the first thing. I enjoyed that. The second thing is, you talked about him finding his level, Taylor. That's true. The other thing is, by most standards, he's had a really solid career. Not that you're saying anything to the contrary. 5,000 minutes in Liga, 4,000 in Austria, another 3,000 across MLS, Belgium, the Netherlands. The Man City move didn't pan out and was probably not a good move for his career in hindsight and also maybe in foresight. But what I will say is that's a cool thing to do. It's cool to go to Man City. It's cool to write your name on the piece of paper and have it say Manchester City on it after you've come up for Sporting Kansas City. There's a lot to like. Palmer-Brown has accomplished a lot in his career, was a fun player for the U.S. youth national team. The reality is he's just never quite been good enough at any one thing. That may come up later in a different question to really warrant his inclusion in U.S. rosters consistently or to have him progress to the absolute highest levels of the game. But at 27, which is still wild to me, I honestly had no idea how old Erik Palmer-Brown was. Could have been 24, could have been 30, no clue. 27, right down the middle of those things. He's had a really impressive career, and I very much hope that we see him get back to his best in Greece, which is kind of a fun place to play, or at least it can be.
Yeah, definitely. So, by my count, he's played in Greece, France, Austria, Holland, Belgium, England, Portugal, and either Kansas or Missouri. Nobody knows. So that's 8 different countries. Is there a more cultured US player out there? I'd love to know.
Good question.
I think it has passport stamps. Who else has played in more places? I don't know.
There's got to be a couple that are up there, but he's a top tier guy. EPB. There is not an obvious one that's coming to mind for me, Taylor.
Josie has Netherlands, England, Turkey, USA, Canada. I'm not sure if there's another one in there. Spain, doesn't he go to Villarreal first? Mm-hmm. So Spain, even though he doesn't actually play there, he gets loaned out somewhere else. So Josie is up there, but I'm not sure if he can surpass Erik Palmer-Brown, who is still playing and can still make moves.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So obviously, only 27 years old, so he's got a couple more countries in him, I say. Imagine all the different foreign currency and coins he has rattling around somewhere. Incredible. Wow.
I hope he saves that, as everyone does. He saves his money from his travels, and now he's got another souvenir for his career. I should add, I think as he's recovering from that, the bone marrow issue, he picks up a stress fracture. And in my understanding, which is very limited, so I look forward to the Discord yelling at me, one of the ways you can get a stress fracture is if you have an existing injury. It makes you maybe if you have a sprained ankle and you walk on your foot differently than you normally do to compensate for that pain. If you're then placing stress on parts of your foot or parts of your ankle or whatever that you don't usually place a strain on, that can lead to a fracture or other issues. And it sounds like that's what he did. He also did that, I believe, when he was a Sporting Kansas City player. So there is a longer history of injuries and kind of persistent problematic injuries along the way. So hopefully he can kind of recover form this season, have a good one with Panathinaikos, and then continue that journey. I guess Turkey is next if he's moving in a sort of
that's good.
southeastern direction.
Well,
Let's get into Turkey.
And then he can do the Turkey to Saudi pipeline, or I don't really know if it's a pipeline so much as it is is this player playing in Turkey or Saudi Arabia? No one but Graham Ruthven knows sort of situation. I think that's on the table for him as well.
It's one of my favorite quiz games that we occasionally play.
There it is. All right, Richard Rolson, thank you very much. I hope you learned whatever happened to Erik Palmer-Brown, ? As Joe likes to Google. Let's jump to the next question from RJ. This year, there are more than a dozen USMNT players on teams competing in the Champions League, with many starting and making major contributions to their teams. However, it appears, says RJ, there's not a single USMNT player on a team in the Europa League. Do you have any theories about why this is? Joe, you've shown an expert line in fact-checking so far in this episode. Can we fact-check? Is that right? Is there no Europa League representation?
That is incorrect, although I do think there is something to the premise of this question anyway, and I like it. This is a fun one. Tanner Tessman is in the Europa League with Lyon. That's one. Taylor Booth with FC Twente as well. He's played in the Europa League just last month. Jonathan Gomez with PAOK is also in the Europa League, although he's not really playing for PAOK and is also not realistically in the U.S. pool at this point. So there are certainly a couple, and that's not nothing in the Europa League. Also, some
Timmy Chandler Eraser will not stand.
Timmy Chandler Eraser, absolutely. Also, in terms of Europa League qualifying, George Bello with Lask, and then EPB as well with Panathinaikos was involved in Europa League qualifying. But really, there are two guys that are firmly in the U.S. pool. Tessman much more so than Booth, but Booth I think is in this conversation that are in the Europa League. So I think there is something a little bit off here in the question. But if we expand RJ's question or point to why are there so many U.S. players in the Champions League compared to the Europa League, I think there are some interesting answers for that. Maybe to skip to the end, I think the spread is pretty much even and is what you would expect. But the way that the Europa League picks teams from smaller leagues instead of just picking the next 5 from the big leagues, I think shifts the kinds of players that are in the Europa League that really populate that tournament. But if we zoom out, I think there's a pretty even spread of U.S. players across European levels. You have your Champions League guys. You have your Pulisics, your McKennies, your Weahs, your Pepis. You have those players. Then you have the next tier down of players. Maybe you have your Europa League guys like Tessman, who is in the Europa League. Maybe Johnny Cardoso's in that tier as well. Betis is not in the Europa League right now, but they are a good team in Europe. They are a very solid kind of mid to upper mid-table team in a major European league. I think about Chris Richards being in this tier, Jedi Robinson, Joe Scally. There's a lot of U.S. players in what I would think of as the Europa League tier, like the second tier underneath the Champions League, but their teams just aren't in the Europa League for varying reasons. And then you have your third tier sorts of players, which is, in my head, players in lower level teams in big leagues. And Gianluca Busio comes to mind here with Venezia, where Venezia play in Serie A. Serie A is a big league. It's one of the best leagues in the world. Venezia are not a very good team in that league. Luca De La Torre was in this tier with Celta Vigo before he goes to San Diego on loan. And also in this maybe third tier of players, you have fairly good teams in smaller leagues. And George Bello might be a decent example of that. Even, maybe you could toss Taylor Booth into this equation. Some guys sort of straddle the lines. My basic answer to go all the way back, and I kind of said it already to lead into this discussion, I think the spread is even, but the way that the Europa League goes about picking teams, a lot of them coming from smaller, less heralded leagues, I think that really does mean that the spread is pretty darn even across the board.
I think I would largely agree with Joe, although I think the question is really interesting because it's one that I assumed was, to be honest, incorrect. I was like, no, there's got to be a lot more guys in the Europa League. Then I sort of assumed it was it's because it is just a ton of smaller teams. There's some pretty known entities in the knockout round this time around, not that Joe is saying anything to the contrary. But I think it is a question that I initially was like, I'm sure there's a reason. And the more I look at it, the more I think it's harder to find a definite concrete reason. My best attempt at explaining it, aside from what Joe has already said, is I think that there's a couple of things here. Number one being that Americans largely are not yet a draw. And so I think about that with the USMNT, if they play games in Europe, I don't think that there are many European national teams that are going to get more fans than they already would because they're playing the United States. I don't think the U.S. has that level of player, certainly not a widespread level of player. So Christian Pulisic might be the exception, and even there, I don't know if he is the marquee name for that Milan team, at least not at present. So I think with Americans then, you do have like the national team, the starting 11 or the quote unquote starting 11, who are maybe going to command some of those bigger moves, who are going to be with bigger clubs. But I think aside from that, the American market is youngsters, and you're looking for youngsters who haven't yet broken through, who you can get sort of cheaply, you can put into your reserve team or your academy, you get them kind of spot starts here and there, but you're not really looking for them to be consistent first-team starters right away. And so I think there's this gap of youngsters making moves and then senior team players making moves or making moves again, and in between, to Joe's point, you have people like George Bello, who are making European moves, but maybe aren't in that next tier. They're not in the European places sorts of clubs. They are a little bit lower down, or if they do make that jump, it feels like they are maybe not the primary reason why that would be happening. And so I think just clubs in the Europa League are going to invest in domestic players, in local players, or in players that are kind of already established within that league or that system. I don't know how much they are then going to Major League Soccer to try to pull over a 24-year-old who could maybe make a difference.
Yeah, I love that point, Taylor, and that's something I was thinking about here as well, or at least something adjacent to that. At the Champions League level, those teams often are looking elsewhere for talent, or at least they're able to go and make splashes to supplement their domestic players with really high-quality foreign players. Europa League teams, if we just kind of take that as the secondary European tier of teams, but I think the point I was trying to make before is it's not just the second-tier big European teams, it's also like weirdly much smaller teams that get in from various different pathways. Those teams are largely on more equal, not equal, but more equal footing with Major League Soccer teams. Some certainly better, probably almost all better, maybe not all the way across the board. They're not going to go out and pillage MLS for talent when they already have players of that level in their leagues. And they're not going to go and splash on Christian Pulisic out of an academy in the United States because they either don't have the resources or aren't the draw themselves to lure those high-quality players over, like a Gio Reyna when he's in the NYCFC academy. He's not going to, the third best team in Hungary. He's going to Borussia Dortmund. So the players they already have in a lot of these Europa League team kind of levels are more or less equivalent, certainly more equivalent than Champions League teams are to Major League Soccer, which means they're not going to go out and sign, Cole Bassett just for the heck of it, although that is sort of something that's happened before. They are going to go ahead and stick with the existing core that they have, and they don't have the money largely to go splash on a Pulisic or a Reyna or a Tyler Adams, etc.
Yep. One other thing from me, and this is much more anecdotal than it is like observed fact, but I think, like, if I asked you all what leagues tend to do the best in the Europa League, generally speaking, I feel like Spain would be the one that comes first to mind, largely because of Villarreal and Sevilla having all the success they have had. What other leagues would you all say?
Italy.
Yeah, Italy. Maybe England still as well in there.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe Italy is changing, but I think like maybe Germany was on that list for a little while. But I think of like leagues where Americans have obviously broken through and gotten minutes, and it's England, it's the Netherlands. Outside of that, like I guess it was the Bundesliga for a while. Now it feels like more Serie A, but it's not Spain, it's not Switzerland, it's not Portugal, it's not Belgium really. I guess we have a lot of Americans playing in Belgium, but Belgian teams don't tend to do a ton in the Europa League. So I also think there is a little bit of like a lack of diversity in where Americans end up playing. Like La Liga is the prime example of that. Now there's a couple, but for the longest time, there were no Americans playing in La Liga. And so I think there's also, to me, an idea that you don't have as many Americans playing in as many different leagues as maybe is required to get that number higher than it already is, which is still some, as Joe has already pointed out, but maybe not the number that we would have expected.
All right. Well, we will be talking about an American playing in Spain very shortly in this episode and much more, including looking at the wings and fullbacks on the USMNT, and we're looking at the Pulisic documentary coming after this break. Join us then. Total Soccer Show, welcome back to USMNT Weekly. We go now to a question from Peter Shark from our Discord, who says, while we're in the Dest is injured era, as Joe would like to have it, what would you rather see? A, Musa at right back and Weah on the wing. B, Weah at right back and Musa on the wing. Number 3, we just tell them to interchange. Or number D/4, something else. I lost count of where I was doing numerals or
That was awesome.
Letters there. Anyway,
I think it's important to note that Ryan said, guys, I have really strong opinions on this one, so please let me answer first. I have really concrete ideas about how this should go.
He yelled into his mic, clear out.
Yeah.
So,
it was, it was abrasive I'm not going to lie. So,
I felt
Ryan,
that
did you
way.
want to share those now, or did you want to hold off for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I just flipped my four-sided coin. It's number 2/B.
All right. So Ryan has weighed in with authority. Joe, how say you?
I was trying to think of another thing that could come second in a list that would be common, like the number 2 or the letter B. I'm coming up empty. I prefer option 1 / letter A / number 1. Because honestly, even though Poch has done it a lot so far, I don't like Musa on the wing. He doesn't create danger. Even beyond that, though, right now, I'd rather keep Musa in lower risk areas because I don't think he's taking a step forward. I think he is still in a pretty rough patch of his professional career. So if the choice is to use these two players in these two spots, and I recognize that Peter did give us an out there, and I'll get to that in just a second, I would prefer to go Musa at right back and Weah on the wing because I think it maximizes Weah. Even though I like Weah as a right back, I wouldn't prefer Musa on the wing. So I would go Musa right back, Weah sort of right wing if we're thinking about just that right side. That said, option 4, something else, letter D, I am still totally fine with Joe Scally playing as a right back and having Tim Weah on the wing and Musa either in midfield or Musa on the bench, depending on who else is fit and available in that midfield group. Honestly, I think that's the safest option out of the 3, or 4, I suppose, and could very well be the best one. I think, Taylor, you and I ran through some USMNT lineups and sort of looked ahead to the March window. Now that we're in March, finally, we did that last week. And I had my lineup with Scally as right back and staying a little bit deeper to join the center backs in possession and Weah on the right wing. And I had an Adams, McKennie, Reyna midfield trio, and I had Yunus Musa on the bench. I think that is a completely fine way to go. But if I have to choose between the two, I want Musa at fullback, Weah on the wing. Otherwise, probably Scally. And I don't know that I feel strongly one or the other of Scally or Musa at right back at the moment.
I echo pretty much all of that, except I went with option 4, Scally at right back, Weah on the wing, Musa
Nice.
where he's needed as my primary one. And then if I'm choosing between the other options, I would say Musa at right back, moving centrally, Weah staying wide and kind of stretching things for running in behind. So it sounds like we're on the same page, which is nice, especially because I felt very uncertain about this question for some time, and then I feel like it clicked in that last episode you mentioned, Joe. And now we can succinctly answer this one theoretically until we go to Ryan for his... He says he has a 10-point answer, so I want to make sure he gets all those points in.
We're on pins and needles waiting for 1 to 10. Maybe while Ryan is figuring out the best way to deliver that, I do want to add
Ryan
a
is
couple things
Googling,
here.
who is Joe Scally?
I'm on ChatGPT right now.
I think so. Poch in the past has mentioned Musa as a right back option, so I think that's notable. It's not something that we've seen before, but Poch has watched the tape and seen that he's played that for Milan at times this season, and recognizes that is a club that can be in Musa's bag. That's one thing. The other thing in all of this is so much depends just on who's fit and who's available. And I like that Peter talks about this, Dest is injured era that we're in right now. A lot of this changes when Sergino Dest comes back. How much changes? We still don't really know. It's a little TBD, but injuries can shape this so much. And if you're missing a Reyna or a McKennie or an Adams in midfield, or multiple of them in midfield, I think the choices get a lot simpler. At the same time, then you have the complexity of Tanner Tessman and Johnny Cardoso, and have they earned real minutes with the U.S.? Maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of, I guess, mush, but I don't mean that in a bad way. A lot of question marks, I suppose, in this pool. Where is there really a big difference right now between Musa and Cardoso, and between Cardoso and Tessman, between Tessman and Musa? I don't think so. Probably not a ton. It's something to watch, and I think Poch has genuine decisions to make in the midfield and at right back at the moment, while Sergino Dest is out injured. The last thing on this, I'm still surprised at how much run Poch has given Musa on the wing, and maybe he sees something I don't. Like maybe he sees something that we just haven't yet seen ourselves in Yunus Musa, and this is a trend that continues not just in the March window but beyond. I don't know. I would be a little surprised if that happened, but a lot is on the table in these roles, even though it seems to me and to you, Taylor, as well, and of course to Ryan, not to preempt his 10 points, that maybe it's fairly simple.
Well, there you go. Listen, I hope you enjoyed my detailed 10-point analysis there. I know it was very long. If you didn't hear it, we had to cut it for time. The editing machine is now fixed. Peter Shark, thank you very much indeed for your question there. Let's go to Discord Stew with a good one here. In reviewing the Pulisic documentary in The Guardian, Leander Shelikans contrasts earlier USMNT generations who would just do about anything to garner attention for their sport and themselves, understanding innately that their economic survival depended on it. Compare that to the generation of today, who shy away from that kind of engagement. Do you think this is true? says Discord Stew, and if so, does it matter? Taylor, I think it's a really interesting point, and Leander's article in The Guardian is very much worth reading about Pulisic's documentary. But I couldn't help thinking that the idea that players, previously might have had their economic survival depend on these kind of things is not just exclusive for US players, but maybe it's true of most soccer players these days.
I think you would have to go back further, like in England, to find a time when players were struggling for like viability and visibility, in my opinion. I do think that there's a ton of validity to this idea Leander proposes, and I think a prime example of that is Alexi Lalas, who will tell you that and has told people that and has told us that on this show before, that when he was coming through, they're playing on bad pitches, there's not a ton of interest, there are not a ton of fans. There's the CCR line of like, if I only had $1 for every song I've sung, every time I've had to play while people sat there drunk. Plenty of drunken people still in attendance at US games, but that resonates for like a crowd that isn't really into it, that doesn't really care. And I think that was a lot of the crowds in the early 90s. And you had no league existing in Major League Soccer. Then you had a league existing, but the league contracting. You had a bad World Cup in 1998. You didn't have a ton of soccer on TV, certainly not American soccer on TV as much. You didn't have as much coverage of it. And so I think there was an idea that in order to get people interested, you have to do interesting things. And again, Alexi is a prime example of that. And I think that's some of the takes he has had and the positions he has advocated in the past, I think he would say, are positions that sometimes he genuinely believes and feels, but also if people are talking about soccer and if people are talking about the sport, then he's doing his job, because for the longest time they weren't. So I do think that was a thing that a lot of the kind of that generation of player had to deal with and had to show up at minor league games to pitch their book and to talk about life as a player and just trying to find ways to kind of keep themselves and the sport front and center. Whereas now I think the sport has grown so much in this country that there is kind of an idea that players maybe don't want to put themselves in the spotlight as much because people are already interested, and social media is going to take your quotes out of context and your likes out of context. And so why try to engage? And I almost think it's gotten to the point now where that's kind of my theory as to why the Pulisic documentary exists, is that someone has said to him, the U.S. is hosting a World Cup or joint hosting a World Cup in 2026. We need a star name to be the leader for this team, and no one's really doing it, so it could be you. And so I think he is trying to be the most visible player in this team, sort of by default, because I'm not sure anyone else really could be, but also I'm not sure anybody else really wants to step up and put themselves in the spotlight in that way. So I think we have moved from players being desperate to be in the spotlight to players being a little bit more hesitant to be in the spotlight, at least on a personal level.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I suppose my point about it being a general soccer thing rather than the US soccer thing is just like, life is different now. Modern life is different with, back in the day where you might have to do a bit more traditional media and PR to rise above the parapet, so to speak. Whereas today, everyone's online, everyone's got a camera phone. You are exposed as a big soccer player. And obviously the game is bigger in the US as well, and probably other territories realistically. Yeah. So you have to, there's probably an inclination, Joe, for younger players now to want to do less because they're always on anyway.
I think there's absolutely something to that. The way that messages are distributed now compared to 30 years ago has changed in a grave way. Like, it is very, very different now, and in some ways worse than it used to be. At the same time, I do think there's a sense in which the question is absolutely right here, because the economic survival is simpler now for a lot of these top tier US players who are making more money. They have more paths to revenue, even through things like social media. I guess I do sort of want to push back. Even though I think I agree with all this, I want to push back a little bit, because I think we are conflating Christian Pulisic with the entire U.S. pool here, frankly. Because I think about Weston McKennie, who is very much happy to be in the spotlight, is in truly commercials. I think about Tyler Adams, who has done an absurd amount of media, who's done stuff with Men in Blazers, who's done TV. Like, he does a ton of media stuff and is happy to do that stuff and is excellent at it. I think about someone like Gio Reyna, who I sure would imagine that he would be more than happy to do more media stuff if all of the World Cup things hadn't blown up in his face. Jedi Robinson is a personable and quite active in the media sort of figure. Tim Weah is the son of a president. And
is he? I don't think I've ever heard Jedi speak.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he plays piano, does magic tricks, is in a bunch of quite viral social media videos.
Does he play guitar with Hootie and the Blowfish, though, Joe?
Honestly, I don't know. I would assume the answer is no, but I'm not willing to rule it out all the way. I kind of feel like we've just tossed all these players into the Christian Pulisic bucket, and I just don't think that's true necessarily. I do think, though, to close out in a point that I agree with on all this, and this is probably the overarching point, we are talking about these guys not craving the spotlight and needing to go after it in the same way as the last generation. I think that is true. Like, I don't think we see players go out there and put themselves in front of cameras in the same way with the same need that players from past generations did. But man, maybe somehow with the change of media over time, it's been harder to track that stuff. And Ryan, I think maybe you're getting to part of that. But I think there are plenty of U.S. players that are more than happy to engage and are eager to do so, frankly.
I think that there are players that are okay with fulfilling their media obligations, certainly. I don't know if there are as many players who, if I ask Weston McKennie, are you concerned about the viability of soccer in the U.S. soccer landscape? Sure. I have to believe he'd be like, no. Like, everybody plays soccer. Everybody watches soccer.
Totally.
We're hosting a World Cup. What are you talking about? Whereas I think teams of like 1994 and certainly 1990 would be like, yeah, no one cares. I asked Steve Cherundolo that once. I was like, does your wife, who's from Hanover, does she care? Like, were her parents stoked that she married a footballer? And they were like, they thought it was cool, but they didn't know an American could play. So they were kind of confused as to what I was doing here. And I think that was just kind of it for so long. I don't think there was a spotlight on Americans, that much interest in Americans playing soccer, because there wasn't as much interest in the sport up until, I mean, very recently in my mind. Like, it's probably at like 2014 is, I feel like, when it kind of really fully crosses over, and maybe still hasn't to this day, because it's still not, the dominant sport in America, nor will it be for some time. But I think that the idea of, do you worry about the viability of the sport and the sustainability of the sport in the United States is not a question that this generation has really had to face the way the older generation probably did.
Yep, totally agree. I think anybody who disputes that would be foolish. The point that I'm simply trying to make is if we're talking about U.S. players doing things to garner attention for themselves, that's word for word in the question, I think there are plenty of U.S. players who are doing that and would like to do more of that if given the opportunity. That's all I'm saying. Okay. Pulisic, though, probably not one of them, as it turns out.
Like, I don't disagree with that. I would ask you this, though, Joe. My experience with mixed zones after U.S. games is that some players will stop. Some players will stop if it is their turn to stop, and a lot will just walk on by and not try to speak to the media. And I have to believe that, like, early 90s teams, they are talking to everybody they can possibly talk to. And I think that's kind of where I'm coming from with this one. I agree with you that players will do their obligations and will fulfill sponsorship requests and do interviews and the like, but I just think there is less of a, like, we have to do this for the sake of the sport. So maybe we're saying the same thing, but just from different perspectives.
And I think what I would say to that is I think we are saying the same things, but from different perspectives.
Yeah.
There's a difference now between Alexi Lalas having to stop in the mix zone because that's the only way anybody's going to hear from him. Maybe Alexi's not the best answer. And Weston McKennie skipping the mix zone because he's going to go do a TV commercial. Like the forms that the U.S. players, the top ones, are able to get their messages out and to get themselves out. And Ryan, you got to a lot of this earlier. In 2025 are so different, and the opportunities, the level of those opportunities are both larger in number and greater in quality now than they were 30 years ago. That's the point I'm trying to make, and I think U.S. players, by and large, are smart enough to recognize that. Would it be good for the United States and for soccer in this country if Christian Pulisic and Ricardo Pepi, and you can name players that cover large different swaths of demographics and quality levels and are going to be key players for this team now and in the future? Would it be good for the sport and for the growth of the game in the United States if those players did more, even more than they are doing now, and did it more eagerly in Christian Pulisic's case? That's a huge part of the question from Stu here. Does this matter? Like, if this change is real, does it matter? I think we all recognize that it has changed in one way or another. I think it totally matters. I think if Christian Pulisic was a super eager and marketable sort of individual, that helps with the sport's popularity in the United States. I don't think it matters a ton. I don't think if Christian Pulisic is, going on Jimmy Fallon, 5 times in his career instead of 1, that it makes a massive, landscape altering sort of difference. But does that stuff help? Absolutely. And I think if these U.S. players had that same, I'll take anything I can get mentality that players from the 90s did have, that would probably move down the ball down the field like, a half a yard or a full yard.
Yeah, there you go. Game's changed. One follow-up question from me, Taylor. Have you seriously never heard Anthony Robinson's speak, or you just heard that he's got a British accent and you chose not to hear it?
That.
Got it. Thanks
No,
for the
I've
clarity.
heard him speak periodically. It's the same as Cameron Carter-Vickers, where when they're wearing a U.S. shirt, you kind of forget the Englishness until they speak, and then you're like, oh, right. I forgot there was an accent there. So I have heard him speak. I just haven't seen him do as much in terms of media obligations and appearances and the like.
There you go. All right. Discord Stu, thank you very much indeed for your question. We take a break. When we come back, we're talking Johnny Cardoso. Join us then. Total Soccer Show, welcome back to USMNT Weekly. Shreyas has been in touch. Hello, Shreyas. And Shreyas says, could you talk about Johnny Cardoso a little bit, please? How does the US need to tweak the system when he plays so we see the Johnny Cardoso of Betis show up for the USMNT? Taylor, apparently Cardoso, I'm reading, a subject of a potential Tottenham transfer to balance their midfield.
Hasn't that been happening for a while? Haven't they had right of first refusal for like 15 years now on Johnny Cardoso?
Which is still like just a bizarre thing. That whole thing, I think, broke, maybe it was this past summer, where there was some juice about that, and I didn't know we did right of first refusals in soccer. You learn things every day, Taylor.
You do.
Tottenham
you
have
do.
the discovery rights, is what we...
Yeah, right. That's right.
And they have the number one spot in allocation order, I believe. I don't know how that quite works. Shreyas did also say I would love to hear from Graham specifically because Graham watches more La Liga and seems to watch more Real Betis. So I reached out to Graham, and I think Graham gave a very, very good answer. Here's what Graham said. The theory on Johnny is that for Betis, he's playing for a team that doesn't always have the ball and that allows his good qualities, primarily his defensive qualities, to come to the fore. His best two games for Betis this season have been against the two Madrid teams, when Betis had the minority share of possession. So for the U.S., he's generally asked to play CONCACAF opponents who the U.S. dominate. Therefore, he struggles. The interesting thing there is, would you get a Betis Johnny against a stronger opponent, say in a World Cup, where the U.S. will be against the ball a lot? Maybe, but it's a gamble to count on getting that player by dropping him into the USA's biggest and most consequential games. And I think there is a lot of truth to what Graham is saying there. I would add, Johnny has made 18 appearances, if my math is correct, for the United States, about 578 minutes, so he's averaging about 32 minutes an appearance, so he is oftentimes being used as a substitute. Almost all of those are under Berhalter or some interim manager connected to Berhalter, so that does bear remembering because a lot of the times with the U.S., the system under Berhalter, maybe in the approach, didn't suit a player like Johnny, and maybe when other players around him were struggling to make things work themselves, he then isn't going to look particularly good. Part of this, for me, on a personal note, is seeing him in the U.S. get absolutely worked by Colombia this past summer. I was there in person. I watched him give the ball away. I watched him not be able to turn, like under very minimal pressure. I watched him try to do bounce passes.
Taylor.
What's that?
He's not an ambi-turner.
He's not an ambi-turner, no. He's also not always great at bounce passes when the ball goes into his feet and he's got somebody on his back. Twice he gave it away. So I went back and looked at my notes from him in that Colombia game, and I do think that is the biggest reason why I have skepticism towards Johnny, because I was there when he looked very, very not up to speed, nor did the rest of the United States. And so that is my final thing I will say on this one, is just that under Mauricio Pochettino, maybe the U.S. does have less possession. Maybe they are a bit more direct, and maybe that does suit his game. So I think he's another one who I haven't enjoyed in those 18 appearances thus far. One of those is under Pochettino, I believe. And then I think he's out in like the 28th minute due to injury, so couldn't get a huge sample size there. But I do think he's a player who we could see become a critical player for the U.S. or a critical depth player for the U.S. under Pochettino. That's what makes having a new coach exciting.
Yeah, I agree with so much of that. This Graham Ruthven fellow seems savvy. We should get him on the show sometime if we can pull that off. I think he'd add a lot. That was great. I enjoyed that a lot.
I should have just stolen that for myself and then had Graham say, like, nah, he's no good.
Missed opportunity there for sure. My read on Cardoso, and we talked about this a month or so ago. He's best as a 6. He's more destroyer than he is anything else. Fairly good timing defensively, tall enough to be somewhat physically imposing, covers ground, doesn't accelerate super quickly, can connect passes, certainly better than someone like Yunus Musa, I think, in midfield, but is not, as you said, Taylor, a plus on the ball and build-up, and is not a guy who's great under pressure. He's more connector than creator in the double pivot, though he can range a bit higher up and do a little bit of connecting in the final third as well. My read on Cardoso, and I think this mirrors basically everything you said, Taylor, he's not truly great at any one thing. I know Graham talked about him being better defensively and in those more combative games against the Madrid teams where Betis aren't going to have a lot of the ball. He is better equipped for those kinds of games. And I also love the point that was made there that the U.S. is going to play some of those kinds of games. So there will be a natural sort of tweak towards some of the things that Johnny is maybe more inclined to do. But because he's not absolutely great, or maybe even like very good at any one thing, I don't think there's a need to tweak the US's system to accommodate him. He's not, and even more than that, he's just not the kind of player that you accommodate, right? He's a functional, fairly reliable, although he's had several of those issues in build-up, even against modest pressure. He's a functional, like mostly reliable midfielder. That's what he is. He's a good player. He's playing at a good level. He is not a great player. And honestly, I don't think there is a way to tweak the US's system to accommodate a player like Johnny, who is solid and functional, but not unique or uniquely great at any one thing. If you go super build-up heavy, you don't play to his strengths because he's good but not amazing on the ball. If you go super direct and pressy, you don't play to his strengths either because he's good but not amazing in the tackle and is mobile but not absurdly mobile. So you just end up with, you put Johnny Cardoso into a team and he's going to give you fairly solid defensive work and you hope that he is mostly fine on the ball. That's where the US is. Like they can use a player like that who's playing at Betis. There's no doubt about that. I would have him in US teams. I would have him sort of on the edges of the lineup if someone like Tyler Adams is out. You would feel fairly comfortable putting Johnny Cardoso into the team. He is a super fine, like useful player. He is just not someone that you tweak the system for. Maybe the last thought on all this is, it is, I think as a general rule, and this is the Ryan Bailey principle, harder to look good at the international level than it is at the club level because the international level is a mess and tactics are tenuous at best at times, even with someone like Poch who has ideas of how he wants this team to play. It's still just going to be clunky unless you have amazing players with amazing chemistry who have played a lot of games together or are absurdly talented. It's just really hard. So I'm not surprised we see Cardoso look better for Betis than he does for the US, but I don't think that's likely to change, frankly, anytime soon, even if someone like Poch did completely revamp the system around him, which I don't think you can do.
Plus, at Betis, he's playing with legends of the game like Cucho, Anthony, and Isco.
Well
I can't
said.
believe that's
The big
actually
three.
accurate at this point with how good they have been. Those
I love
three for that
Betis.
team.
Yeah, I love Betis now.
I think the summary I would say from what Joe has said, from what I have said, and you could hear it honestly in Joe's answer, is that Johnny's he's inoffensive. Like we're not going to be annoyed if he's in the 23-man squad or the 26-man squad, but I don't think that it's going to be like, oh yeah, Johnny's in there. It's like and the way Joe is running through, like he's good at this, he's fine at that, he's above average here. Like it's just he's not going to set the world alight. I think he could. I think if he continues to kind of raise his game with Betis, I think if he becomes exceptional instead of pretty good at a few things, I think I will have greater enthusiasm for him. If we see him go into a Pochettino team and shine and do a lot of things that we haven't seen him do previously, I'm going to be stoked. I just share Joe's not even concern, just realistic opinion that it's not worth changing the tactics to get him in there because he is going to be good defensively but not really help you in the attacking phase. And to Graham's point, when we're playing teams that we would expect to dominate, at least in terms of possession and opportunity, you want more chance creators, more attackers in there, and that's not going to be Johnny.
There you go. So Shreyas's question of how does the US need to tweak their system, ultimately I think we're saying they don't.
Yep. That's my read anyway.
All right.
But I do think Graham, final thing, sorry Ryan, I do think Graham has a point though, that if you're playing stronger opposition consistently with Betis, he looks really good, Johnny, in a double pivot, in a 4-2-3-1. Maybe you throw him in there with a Tyler Adams and you just kind of lock up shop and you have a really solid defensive pairing through the middle with some good center backs behind you, theoretically, if we can find those.
Where are we getting those?
Exactly.
Are we importing them? Where are we snagging them?
So again, I think he has viability and potential strength within a USMNT lineup. It just has to be the right situation, the right opponent, the right time, and the right skill set. So I guess no different than a lot of other situations for players.
There you go. Well, we'll see if any of Pochettino's squads have Johnny Depth. Was that Cardoso bad? Sorry. Anyway, let's move on from Shreyas's question there. Last one on this episode. JCO54 says, which of these options do you think would be...
Don't encourage him, Joe.
No,
Don't encourage
the
him.
first one, I was going to let him sit in the first one.
Yeah, okay.
And then he clearly was always going to double back with the Johnny Cardoso bat, and I got to respect that. I give it up for that, Ryan. Well played.
You know what this is, Joe. You know what I'm doing here.
So good.
Coming up. All
I
right.
hate how much I love that.
Let's go in for the final question once more from JCO54. Which of these options do you think would be more likely to lead the USMNT to being able to compete for a World Cup title within the next few decades? The options: A USMNT player being among the best 5 players in the world.
Already happened. Tyler Adams.
B, MLS being universally considered the best league in the Western Hemisphere. C, CONCACAF as a whole growing to be considered the third best confederation. Or 4, did that on purpose, the entire USMNT lineup being starters in the UEFA Champions League. For me, Taylor, I think I've made up my mind already. I think it's 4/D. It feels like the way to get the most depth from a squad, but maybe that's short-term thinking, arguably. What do you think?
I will answer your question after asking Joe a question. Joe, if you had to guess what my answer was going to be, what would you have guessed?
Wow. Probably not C. Probably not the CONCACAF one. And that one's at the bottom of my list. Is it the Champions League one? Because I'll be honest, Ryan, that's where my mind went first as well, although I do have a different answer.
Okay. I was wondering if I was going to be the usual Taylor of there's an obvious answer and you both went for D and then I went with something else, because I initially had it as MLS being the best league in this hemisphere, because I think at that point there's going to be more eyes on it. It's going to be a stronger league. You're going to get more talent coming in. However, I think that could also be a double-edged sword of a better, more competitive league might mean fewer minutes for Americans, fewer developmental opportunities for young players coming through, and a better league might have more eyes on the sport, might get more people interested, but it might not lead to a better national team. I don't know if having one player in the top 5 players in the world is going to do that. I don't think the U.S. being the third confederation is really going to level things up that much. So in the end, it feels kind of like the laziest answer, but I think having a squad of 11 players who are all starters for, I'm going to say, good Champions League teams, like no disrespect to Sheriff Tiraspol, but I'm not sure that's going to kind of make the difference. But I think if you have 11 starters who are all playing at that high of a level, it probably puts the U.S. in the strongest position. I think about the national teams that do consistently make it out of their group and make it somewhat deep in the knockout round. They tend to have a lot of Champions League talent. I don't think that's the reason they do it, but I think it's an anecdotal thing of you have that many players playing at such a high level, chances are your national team will be pretty good.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on if we can stratify the Champions League further.
Yeah.
If I could pick 11 starters and have them all playing for Liverpool or for Barcelona or I don't know, even for like Atletico Madrid or Inter Milan.
Sorry, Joe, they all play for RB Salzburg.
Sorry. See, but even if I can pick 11 starters for the best, one of the best like 8 or 10 clubs in the world, I'm gonna pick that one, right? If you're getting Atletico Madrid's 11 or Inter's 11, the U.S. has a shot at the World Cup. They're not going to be favored, I don't think, in any of these realities. I still think the best of the best and the true World Cup favorites are in multiple of these categories at once. Like they have a top 5 player in the world and they have, an 11, 18, 23, 26 player roster full of Champions League players. So I think all that is fair. And I don't think the answer is a bad one, the Champions League one. Ultimately, I ranked these. I had that second on my list because I think it would make the U.S. a good team, probably like borderline top 10 in the world. And you give yourselves a chance with the depth and the variety of quality that you would have in a team like that. That would be a good outcome for the United States in 2 decades. I think that would be a really, really good spot to be in. The U.S. having a player among the 5 best in the world, I put third on my list just because it's kind of a wild card, and there's a lot of other factors there about the rest of the team that you're not controlling for. And then CONCACAF being the third best confederation, I have fourth. I just think the impact of that would be less on the U.S., although I do think it would be a good thing. All these things would be a good thing. I ultimately went with the only one that's left is MLS being the best league in the Western Hemisphere. Brazil has this title right now by all sort of conventional wisdom and metrics and tape and all that stuff. If MLS were to capture it, the overall quality, I think, Taylor, and this is sort of an opposition, I guess, to what you said, I do think the overall quality of the average American player would improve along the way. I recognize the threat of you're also going to be importing more talent. MLS imports a lot of talent right now. They'd import better talent, but you look at the best leagues in the world, England, Italy, Germany, Spain, France, Brazil, Portugal, Belgium, Argentina, the Netherlands. Like, all of those leagues are excellent. Even the ones at the top of the funnel, like England and Italy and Germany and Spain, they play a ton of domestic players. There's room in the inn. Like there's space for young domestic players in even the best leagues in the world. In Brazil, the best league in the Americas, plays a ton of young players and sells a lot of those players to Europe where they can go and develop. I think if you're in that spot as being the top of the funnel in the Americas, I think that does see your domestic product improve. I also think it helps you develop talent because the level is higher and that establishes more rigorous training and just really everything improves in a sort of rising tide lifts all boat situation. There are risks and the foreign element is a risk, certainly. the U.S. is a different soccer landscape than Brazil, as an example. Not just on the cultural side, which I think matters here a lot too. Soccer is relevant culturally on all those leagues that I just mentioned in all those countries that I just mentioned.
No, Brazil has pay to play. What are you talking about? It's
in
the
a way,
exact same thing.
Soccer, those countries are soccer crazed in a way that the U.S. may never be, and so maybe that actually does just go in opposition to what I'm saying here. Of I think this MLS being the best league in the Western Hemisphere would be really good and probably long term the best option. But I think any boost in popularity would help here. And if MLS passes Brazil, it's going to be through a mix of spending on those foreign players, but also improving academy setups and developing young players. Honestly, I think that's kind of the next immediate horizon for Major League Soccer in a lot of ways. They're spending tons of money, these MLS teams, on U22 initiative players. We just ran a piece for Backheeled that Ben Wright put together and did a great job. You know, Ben went through and looked at the numbers. MLS teams since 2021 have spent $300 million plus on U22 initiative players across transfer fees and salaries. That's a lot of money for Major League Soccer. If that money was being invested in homegrown players who are, when you dive into the data and look at the players that are actually producing, it is the U22 domestic players that are producing by and large at a higher level than a lot of the signings that have come in from abroad who miss far, far more often than they hit. If MLS teams and smart ones like Atlanta, who are doing this with Garth Lagerwey, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Chicago take a similar route under Greg Berhalter. If we start to see teams allocate more of those roster spots and more investment towards their academy setups, I do think this is something that MLS is going to do. Not become the best league in the West, but spend more on youth, and I think that would help a lot for the national team.
Joe, to play devil's advocate with your choice there of MLS being universally considered the best league in the Western Hemisphere, I mean, yeah, anecdotally speaking, the current champions don't have the best league in the Western Hemisphere, Argentina. The finalists of the last World Cup don't have the best league in the Eastern Hemisphere. So, obviously the rising tide does lift all ships, and the argument is valid, but there's no perfect answer, I suppose, out of these four options, right? And
no.
I think for me, the weakest one is the USMT having a player among the best five in the world, because one single player does not a great team make. I would put maybe second least important as the MLS being universally considered the best league because of, I don't know how that translates necessarily.
I hear what you're saying, Ryan, about Argentina doesn't have the best league in the Americas, but they just won the World Cup. Croatia have made incredible deep runs in multiple World Cups and went to the World Cup final in 2018. They're not even near the top of this list. My counter to that is consistently the best teams, the most successful ones, the ones that win more trophies by and large, and that win the most games and are filled with the highest quality players, are ones that have very good domestic leagues. I ran through the list already. Like the top teams in the FIFA rankings, by and large, are the ones with the highest quality leagues. That's not universally true. And honestly, I do think the cultural part matters a ton here. And that could scuttle this whole theory that I have about Major League Soccer, where cultural relevance matters in a way that even league quality doesn't. But I think my pushback is you've selected very real but also very sporadic examples. And I think the larger data and the larger pool of teams points to, having a really good domestic league matters a lot.
Yeah. One issue I keep having with this, though, Joe, is like if MLS becomes the best league in the Western Hemisphere, how many spots do they actually jump in terms of best leagues in the world? Because I still think they're, I don't know, 7th, 8th, 9th then at that point.
That's
and there are
right.
still stronger leagues where, like to your point about Brazil, they're still selling those young players to leagues where they are then playing in the Champions League, and that's the goal. So I hear you, and I think there's a lot of logic in what you're saying, and I think you are correct that like long term it probably puts the U.S. in the best position. Strangely, what I end up thinking is that if you could get a combination of MLS being the strongest league in the Western Hemisphere with a top 5 player, that might be my answer.
Now we're cooking.
Because I think there is an idea, and I don't think it's like a model for consistency, but I think there are national teams that have that one player that is head and shoulders above everybody else, either in terms of fame or in terms of ability. And when you have a player like that who then backs it up and you can rely on, it does elevate. And I would say Georgia with Kvaratskhelia at the last Euros, Sweden with Zlatan, Drogba with the Ivory Coast. When you have a player who is in that echelon, Achraf Hakimi with Morocco, it can make a difference because you can rely on that one person who's been there, who doesn't buckle under the pressure. And then if you have a really talented squad of role players around that person, I think it can sometimes be the right combination to lose in a semifinal. So I guess it still doesn't really get us all the way there, but maybe it gets us a little bit closer.
I think, Taylor, that's a great pushback as far as if MLS is the best league in the Americas, how much does that really matter? It's a good question. It gets them further up the list, as you said. It doesn't help them crack the top 5, and it's really possible that I've overestimated. Honestly, the more I think about it, the less confident I am in my answer, and the more I'm thinking the Champions League one might be the way to go. I think coming into this, I was imagining, the U.S. have had 10, 12 Champions League players, pretty consistently for the last few years. At the same time, those are either players by and large on pretty bad Champions League teams, or the ones on the good Champions League teams aren't key players. Yeah. So if we could make the stipulation 11 starters on good to great Champions League teams who are important players, not just 2,000 minutes a year kind of players, but 3,000 minutes a year kind of players, I think I'm chucking all my answer out the window.
Yeah, I think
the more I think about it, that's the way I'm going here.
Brazil are the best example of that in my mind, where it's always in a 23-player squad. It's usually 20 are from high-level Champions League teams. One is a reserve goalkeeper from your domestic league, and then you have 2 sort of veteran players playing in the domestic league, and that's the combination you're looking for, I guess, in the end.
I've actually reread JCO54's question, and now I agree with Joe, because when it says MLS being universally considered the best league in the Western Hemisphere, if you look up the definition of the Western Hemisphere, obviously it runs through the Prime Meridian line, which bisects London.
Yes!
So the Premier League is technically in the Western Hemisphere, the majority of it anyway. Hence, ergo, therefore, the MLS would have to be better than the Premier League. So yeah, that tracks now.
Would have loved to see the U.S. try to enforce that one with the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary of just showing up in London nah, this is our business. We're here now. You all have to listen to us.
All I know is that Nelson Rodriguez said in 30 years that he thinks MLS is going to be better than the Premier League. So, clearly he's onto something, and this Western Hemisphere thing is going to take shape. I'm excited. Where could this go wrong? I can't think of any single reason.
I look forward to 30 years from now when he's like, oh, no, sorry, it was actually an 8, and I read it as a 3. It was 80 years. So check back in 50 years, and we'll totally be there.
Oh, y'all meant 30 Earth years. My bad.
All right, that is USMNT Weekly. Thank you to everybody who has submitted a question to this show. If you want to continue the conversation with us, one more time, patreon.com/Total Soccer Show is where you can access our Discord. We'll have a chat with you in there. Also, you'll get bonus content there too. Please and thank you. But for now, Joe Lowry, thank you very much indeed for your USMNT Weeklying.
Thank you, Ryan. This was fun.
It was fun indeed. Taylor Rockwell. Fun.
Fun indeed. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Joe, who before we started recording said, I think that last question is going to be the most interesting. And I was quiet because I wasn't sure I agreed, and I now fully agree. That was the most interesting back and forth, I think, of a very interesting show. So credit to Joe, credit to Ryan, credit to listeners, credit to Shreyas for the question.
Which is, of course, to say we love all of our questions and listeners equally and love them all and give them all the exact same amount of thought and research and preparation.
Indeed. And also, so much so that I got the question wrong. Credit to JCO54, Shreyas. You're fine.
Wow. On that note, listeners, including but not limited to JCO54 and Shreyas, thank you very much for joining us on this episode. We'll be back very shortly, but for now, bye!